Hey, and welcome to a mini communique. This is Mary-Laurence Bevington, your host, and I wanted to follow up once again on Beatles Anthology. So I've gone through it now amazingly twice. Amazingly because it's this experience that I gravitate towards, but for some reason it's hard too, and I'm having more and more insights around that. One that there's some grief that comes up really strongly around the Beatles. And more I'm realizing this is such a part of the depth of the Beatles, the magic. They came on strong after having played in Liverpool and Hamburg and Europe, all over England, coming to America eventually. February 7th, 1964, they land in New York, go on the Ed Sullivan Show. I think that was February 9th when they were actually on the show. And they play till late-ish in the year in 1966 on tour. And then they go into the studio and make these albums. All this starts when George Harrison's 17, they're playing in Hamburg. By the time George Harrison's 23, they've made Sergeant Pepper's. It's, as David Bowie would say, wham bam, thank you, ma'am, experience, and one of enchantment. Their songs have easily stood the test of time and dream and myth and memory. And the anthology, in its recent iteration, hosted by Disney Plus, is remarkable again. The early anthology that came out in the 90s was incredible. And then this one just adds yet another special touch, especially now that George is also gone. He passed in the early 2000s, and we have still a robust Ringo and Paul, both well into their 80s and playing strong on tours as well as coming out with new music. It's just legends upon legends, these fellows. And even though John and George have left the building, they're so present in the anthology. George, particularly, because he died so much later than John, but John is also really present too, well after his death. And I'm not much of a reviewer. I don't particularly like to critique things because I'm an artist, and I always see ways that I might remake something when I look at other art, listen to other art. I, at the same time, really respect the creative process. And if I don't like it, it doesn't mean it isn't worthy, good, or sending a message that must land. Yet I do want to mention this experience in part to process for myself. You've probably heard me tell this story before, but I came upon the Beatles when I was 9, probably a little younger than that, actually. I had big brothers. One gave me a turntable, and one of my friend's moms took me to a record store and allowed me to buy records on her dime, which was amazing. I bought 3 records: Billy Joel, Stranger, Elton John, A Single Man, and the Beatles' Sergeant Pepper, and started listening that very day to this amazing band. And then I babysat. I worked at a woman's shoe store in high school and made my extra money to spend on more albums and Beatles paraphernalia. I used to walk up to Fantasyland Records and buy old Beatles buttons. And of course, by the time I was, how old would I have been? 12, just, I experienced John Lennon's death. And it was a rite of passage for me. I felt this sort of metacognition in the experience, in that I was floored by it. I hadn't at that point in my life had a lot of experience with death, though my family kind of starts with a death origin story, so I had some. But the experience of being, in this place of tween land, my mind is starting to really conceptually think deeper and wider. And I just remember being grateful that I'd been turned on to them and had already by then so many of their albums and had listened to new songs and seen their movies. And but that death was just a lot to process, as anyone, perhaps small or a grown-up size, would tell you. It was shocking, and perhaps the context of John having just come out of this time off, being a dad, hanging out with Yoko in their place at the Dakota and raising their little boy, Sean. He was 5. He had John's birthday, October 9th. So they'd both turned 5 and 40. And John, at age 40, is essentially gunned down late in the evening and December 8th. And it just shocked everybody. The album Double Fantasy had already been out for just 2 weeks plus, perhaps. Amazing album and quite wonderful for both John and Yoko. And I just kept listening to that album after that death. And in the anthology, I really took my time in my second watching towards the end. The beginnings are fabulous, and there's all this just great stuff, scenes from Ringo in A Hard Day's Night, and sweet young George getting really turned on in India, and of course, Paul and his leadership style, which I always loved. I know sometimes it caused friction, but it was just, he was just so game and just so creative and really trying. I saw trying to bring everyone together, even though there were times where not everyone wanted to be together. And then, of course, John and his ever-present antics and ability also to speak his mind, which is really what made him John. He wasn't afraid. And though humble too, Brian Epstein, their manager, passes away August 26th, 1967, suddenly, maybe overdose, maybe intentional. My intuitive take is it was unintentional, but perhaps born out of depression. And there's footage of John, for example, finding out, and it's just so very shocking and sad. And Paul, too, of course, George and Ringo as well. And then there's also, again, going back to the movies and their sheer comedy, their ever-present sense of humor, which I just adore because to me, this sense of humor makes the world go round, and it's also the divine spark for creativity in so many ways. Even when we're in these deep Baroque styles of creativity, brooding artists, we can lighten it with that sense of humor, which often is an aspect of the wise artist archetype. So I just made that archetype up, but it seems to ring true in my brain anyway. And so I'll just cap this by saying it was just so special to see the anthology concludes with essentially Jeff Lynne producing, because by then George Martin is likely retired. I believe he's still alive, but Lynne is producing, Paul, George, and Ringo getting these songs off the ground that John had recorded on cassette before he died. Yoko had sent them their way, and they put together Free as a Bird, Real Love, and eventually Now and Then. And Now and Then actually came out after George had passed, I believe. And it's just so wild to see them working together. And even this presence of John not being physically in the room, but spiritually in the room. There's an empty chair where he sat. They're hearing him through the headphones, and they're even working the song the way that they did. And they remark on that. George talks about how, yeah, well, someone would come in with a song and they might not have it finished, but we'd sort of figure out the middle and the bridge and such together as a little group, a team. And there's a melancholy I must share about Ringo. I've always been struck by that. Those eyes, he's got those really beautiful blue eyes, and there's a sadness there, and really to all of them. And you can partly see it in just their origin stories with Ringo didn't really have a father presence in his life and worked a lot with early childhood and throughout childhood health stuff. Paul lost his mom when he was a youngish teenager, and George perhaps just has that old soul sadness about him. And he was just so young coming up and everything, the youngest of the Beatles, born in February 25th, 1943. I say it that way because apparently he's actually not sure. He wasn't sure if he was born the 24th or the 25th. And then there's John, of course, having lost his mom when he was a teenager, and then she was hit by a car. Paul lost his mom to cancer. It was actually a bonding narrative for the two of them. And also John's dad wasn't really in the picture. He's, I believe, a merchant marine and out to sea a lot and a performer himself too, but didn't reconnect with John until later in life. And John missed that, though he had an uncle that filled that role somewhat for him. But there's that sadness there, and even the sadness of the Blitz during World War II happening actually during John Lennon's birth, and Paul and George were born after the Blitz. Ringo was born before, but it was a heightened bombing period in London and other spots in England. And they're born into that. And it's, really a crack in the world when that event happened in World War II in the 20th century. So Beatles born out of so much of this myth of the breakdown and what remains and creating from the remains, just as when JFK is killed in the US November 22nd, 1963, and then they come in February of 64, and really, it's the British invasion. They just Beatles come to America and nothing's ever the same. And if you get a chance to see the movie yesterday, as if the Beatles have never been, and it's a world where the Beatles don't exist, though there are people who remember that there was a phenomenon called the Beatles. It's sort of a melding of realities movie, but such a incredible imagining of a world without Beatles is a different world. A world with Beatles is, for me, the world I want to live in. And I want to completely end this now by putting a shout out. This is a bit of a lark, but I'd really like to go to SNL in New York, Saturday Night Live in New York on May 16th because Paul is the musical guest for the fifth time. Will Ferrell is the host for the fifth time. And I've got all these shenanigans in place to try to get a ticket. But if any of you have a line on that, I'd love to know about it. And I'm pretty much asking everyone I know. And yeah, so it's real love. Yeah, love me some Beatles. All right, recording today on the Scorpio full moon. It was exact just under 2 hours ago, about an hour and 40 minutes ago. Really special full moon. My sun is on the opposite of this full moon, so oppositional for my deep inner self. So a bit of a day for me, but I feel all right. I'm super grateful to be alive. And I'll probably just call this something about the full moon on our shoulders because I'm in a Beatles role at the moment and feeling you, sensing you, hoping you're doing okay with all the shakes and grooves and rattles and rolls of these times that we're in. So very exciting. All right. I appreciate your stopping by and yours and carrying the light.